Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. I am Missy Wallace with the Global Faith and Work Initiative at Redeemer City to City. And I'm here with Chip Roper, the president of VOCA Center. And we're excited to share with you some thoughts on the theology of calling and vocation. And so before we get started, I thought it might be helpful to comment on who we are and who you are. So I'm the executive director of the Global Faith and Work Initiative, and we exist to help equip people develop ministries around faith and work, really around the world. And Chip, who's the president of VOCA Center, why don't you share what VOCA Center does?
Yeah, we love to apply God's wisdom to work. And for us, a lot of that comes down to helping people discern their specific vocation. You know, what is God calling them to do in the next season of their life?
So Chip's a partner with us in many things that we do, and we often find that we're referring people to Chip who are in job search situations or wanting to rethink their own vocation, etc. And so who are you? Who's here from your side? Many of you are in a class with us right now that is a 6-week class on developing a faith and work ministry for your context. And so to those of you that are in the class, you know each other. I'm glad that you're here. And some of you, we ended up opening this up to the public. And so some of you have ended up joining from another context as well. Some of you are from America. Some of you are from Latin America. I think a couple of you are here from Asia. Most of you are in urban context, but not all of you. Also, some of you are pastors or you're formerly in some type of ministry or nonprofit, and you're here because you want to learn how to equip others to think about their calling and vocation. Some of you are from the marketplace, and you're here because perhaps you're thinking about your calling and vocation, or you're constantly asked to mentor others, and you really would like some better theology when someone comes to you about thinking about their job to help them think about calling and vocation. So we have a variety of people here with a variety of different contexts and objectives for being here. And so I thought I would set it up by letting you know some of the things that we're going to say may come from a Western context, or particularly from a context of people who have a lot of job choice or a lot of thoughts about their job choice. And we know that job choice is a privilege. We do think the theology is going to be the same regardless of your context. So whether you're coming from Asia or from Latin America or from rural America or urban, in an urban context, the theology will stay the same. Some of the models around thinking through the theology may need to be adjusted for different contexts. And feel free to note in the chat if something doesn't feel quite right to you. So with that, we'll get going. Today, we're going to talk about the human need and the ever-present longing to matter. We're going to talk about Western secular narratives versus Christian narratives around finding the right job for you, around finding work. And again, this will primarily focus on people who do have some privilege in their choice. And then we'll look at primary versus secondary calling and the caller. We're going to talk about some of the myths of calling, and then move into some discernment models and ways to encourage others. So whether you're working in ministry or in the marketplace, how can you encourage others? So let's talk about the longing. I think all of us know that what that feeling is. Who am I? Do I matter? And why? What do I do with my time that makes me matter? And I want to share with you some data from Gallup. Gallup, as you know, is a global survey group, and they embarked upon what they called the worldwide survey. They wanted to know what's the whole wide world thinking. And so when they embarked upon that survey, what they were looking for were trends that were consistent no matter what your context. And so it had 160 plus countries in it, developed and developing. And I'm going to read you this quote. Gallup embarked upon its first worldwide survey to determine what the whole wide world is thinking. The poll across more than 100 countries covering the emerging and developed world revealed that what people want more than anything, more than love, money, food, shelter, safety, or peace, is a good job. So let's just think about that for a minute. People say on this survey, no matter what their context, that they want a good job. It's more important to them than these other things. And so this is part of this longing to matter for some. For some, it's survival. And so there are people in this survey that a good job means their children are going to live or die. For others, it's about self-actualization. It's about mattering. It's about who am I? And so this is this universal need to belong and to matter, combined with job being one of the main places people work it out, is a very important concept as people think about their work and as you encourage people to think about their work. So this is what I call the inferiority superiority pendulum. So I will ride this pendulum even in this 1 hour we're presenting together, right? So I think we all ride this pendulum every week, every month, every day, every hour. And it's this going back and forth from losing our center of our identity is in Christ and Christ alone, and getting confused in what our identity is around what we're doing, how we're performing. And so if something goes really well, you'll move over here to the superiority. It'll go from feeling good to a little bit of smug superiority, pride, I'm better than. And then if it doesn't go well, you'll move over here and you'll move, I'm not enough. I'm not enough. So we all know that feeling when something's gone really well in a meeting or really not well in a meeting, or we got the deal or we didn't get the deal. This it's on me thing, this I am the center of the universe. And so vocation is at the center of this pendulum going back and forth. Does this resonate with you, Chip?
Well, you came over today and I was going through these same emotions because I was feeling like, what is Missy going to think of my Zoom setup? And so at first you were impressed, and then you changed everything and you modified everything. And then at the end you said, this is really good. So I was like riding back and forth, but we do. Yeah, it's true. And it's almost like, it's really not spiritual to think more highly of your talents. We know that, right? We recognize that arrogance and that's a problem, but it's also not spiritual to think less of the gifts and abilities and resources that God's given you either, so we really need to find that sweet spot where, we have the sense of who he's made us to be, and we're trusting him for our ultimate worth, and we're not really swinging back and forth, at least not quite as intensely. So there's a freedom that comes as we gravitate toward the center. So important point.
So you're free that I didn't like the vent and Zoom back.
Yeah, it's all good. I'm good. I'm good.
So let's talk about calling as individual story versus calling as part of God's unfolding narrative. So we often work in a world where we are the center of our world and we are the center of everything rather than God being the center. And so when we're operating, when we're the center and the world's revolving around us versus God's the center and we're revolving around that, we have different narratives around work. And so Chip and I will go through a couple. So one very westernized individual calling narrative we give ourselves is, I want to work in areas where I excel. Right? Have you said that? I've said that. We can flip that to be part of God's unfolding story to say, I want to steward gifts I've been given. So Chip's whole job is around helping people understand their gifts and think about stewarding them. One is, how can I fulfill myself? That can be through pay. That can be through a short commute instead of a long commute, through the kind of hours we work, through the promotions we might get, through our voice at the table. So how can I fulfill myself in my role versus how can I serve the God who has called me? So it's just a flip. It's a flip of what the normal Western talking narrative is about work that puts us at the center. It's just flipping. So it's not wrong to want to use your gifts. It's just what's your focus? Is it on you or is it on serving? So it's interesting. Chip and I are actually in a place right now where a lot of people retire to. And so you see a lot of brochures down here. And there's this Western narrative of you work until you can have leisure. So whether it's a vacation or whether it's a retirement, when can I stop working? Instead, I was created to work. God created me to work. So if I think of work for the long haul, and some work is paid, some work is unpaid, I was created to work. You were created to work. I'm not going to work to a finish line and then never work again, right? So it's just different seasons and types of work. Why don't you talk about a couple of the next ones, Chip?
Okay, so on the left, the individualistic focus we have, I work for myself and my family. And if you're from a traditional culture, it's all about your family. Even in the West, which we're not usually from traditional culture, we think about taking care of our families is wrapped up in our own egos pretty tightly, especially our immediate family. Versus, I work for the one who has called me to himself. That God has invited me into a bigger story, his story, through my daily work. And it's very different. Another's calling as an individual story it's about what makes me happy. Happiness is always a shifting target. It's always a moving target anyway. So it's not necessarily the most practical goal, actually. But anyway, I work for what makes me happy versus how does God want me to use my gifts, which is back to the idea of stewarding, or Peter Drucker's great question, what's my greatest contribution? Thinking in terms of contribution. The next one is how much money can I make and how do I want to do it? So it's all about maximizing the financial return. And then on the flip side is thinking, well, how will God provide and how will I store those resources? And it's really about our ultimate trusting. Am I trusting in me to provide for me? Which is actually a challenge for us no matter where we are, I think, on the economic spectrum, versus, how will God provide? And when we're talking about vocational discernment, Missy, we have to think about, it's not just about money. There's so many other factors that get into it in terms of the time, the actual work, the people you're going to be working with. There could be a lot of reasons to take a job that doesn't pay the maximum. And I think on the left side of the column here, we just naturally think, at least in the West, that we have to maximize our potential. Like we just assume that's good, and it's not always good. It's not always good. And then maybe that's the last one there too. How much power and influence can I get, or do I want, versus how can, again, I be a steward, wherever God has called me. And I think, and I'm sure you've seen this too, that sometimes when we get obsessed with where we fit into the organizational hierarchy or in our career, our field, it's kind of that inner ring thing that C.S. Lewis talked about, that instead of it actually being about the work and using our talents and giving God glory through our work, it's about getting glory for ourselves. It's about who's going to recognize us. It's about how it plays. It's not the same thing. And there's a smallness and even dare we say a slavery on the left side of the ledger here. That when we move to the right, there's a lot more freedom, I think.
If you're on the left, if you're hanging out on the left systematically, the pendulum swing is going to be a lot higher.
It's going to be much more intensified. Yeah.
Your highs are going to be a lot higher, and your lows are going to be a lot lower. So now let's move into the difference between primary and secondary call. So many people, since I have been in formal vocational ministry, have called me informally, formally, as a friend, as a relative, as a colleague, and said, I'm trying to figure out my call. And I think to anyone who ever says that to you, what our reply needs to be, who's your caller? Who's your caller? And so even people that aren't Christians say a version of this. And maybe their caller is money or family provision, but as a Christian, our caller is Christ. And so to have a call, we must have a caller. In Galatians 1:15, there's several verses that we could go over with this, but we'll just share this one. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace. So we are called to Jesus. That is our call. That is our primary calling. And so when people say, what is my calling? What is my calling? Let's help root them back to their primary calling. It's interesting. I spent a season as a college counselor, and it was in an independent secular college preparatory school. And a lot of kids were longing to matter. They were longing to find what their call was. And so I would often say, in order to, what's your identity in? What really matters to you? I know what these were non-Christian kids often. I know what mine is in, but what is yours in? And so you can use secular language too when you need to talk to people in the marketplace, et cetera, when they're trying to figure out what's the perfect thing for them. And so if primary calling becomes who we are as God's children, Os Guinness, he's written actually a book called The Call. He's a British theologian, and I highly recommend this book. It's actually on Audible too. I listened to it in the car over a course of some commuting. I love this quote: "Calling is the truth that God calls us to himself so decisively that everything we are, everything we do, and everything we have is invested with a special devotion, dynamism, and direction lived out as a response to his summons and service." So if you have your phone, take a picture of this quote. I have to pull this quote up quite often to just remind myself that I am first called to him so decisively that everything is for him. So then secondary call becomes what we do. Secondary call becomes what we do, and it's called to neighbor, it's called to church, it's called to family, it's called to church, to work, to vocational work. So Chip, you want to read our second quote by Oz?
Yeah. First and foremost, we are called to someone, that's God, not to something, such as motherhood, politics, or teaching, or to somewhere, such as the inner city or outer Mongolia. Our secondary calling, considering who God is as sovereign, is that everyone, everywhere, and in everything should think, speak, and live and act entirely for him. We can therefore properly say, as a matter of secondary calling, that we are called to homemaking or to law or to the practice of art history. But these and other things are always the secondary, never the primary calling. They are callings rather than the calling. They are our personal answer to God's address, our response to God's summons. Secondary calling matters, but only because the primary calling matters most.
And what I love about this is it gives the freedom that to figure out what you're doing vocationally does not have to be the perfect finish line. It's part of a journey. Your call is to Christ. So your secondary calling can evolve. It can change. So especially if I don't know, I can't see everyone's face. I don't know how many of you are in kind of the probably 18 to 35-year-old group or work with people in that group. That particular group feels so much pressure to get it right. My daughter, she is 23 and she's been interviewing for some jobs. She's in kind of a one-year internship and she's been interviewing for some jobs when this is over. And she keeps saying, I don't know if that's what I want to do forever. I'm like, of course you don't. You're 23 years old. Like, you don't have to know if that's what you want to do forever. So I think this quote, get your camera out, take a picture of Oz's words again, or Professor Guinness's words again. This quote is more freedom, I think.
Indeed.
This quote is freedom.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk about this, Chip?
So we're looking at this overlap. You get your primary call, which is who we are. That's about identity. It's established by God creating us and then redeeming us. And then we have our secondary call, which is what we do. And that's kind of how we live it out. And I mean, there's this overlap kind of sweet spot there. So say more about that, Missy, the overlap.
Yeah. So the overlap is where when your secondary call is when you're discerning what God would have of you and you're really using it to serve him and you're really living out the fact that the gospel changes everything, you hit in the overlap.
Yeah, it's like a sweet spot kind of thing. But what I really like about what you're saying is that there's a dynamic process to this, and the dynamic is happening at two different levels. So there's the sense that my vocational work calling can change, and yours has
a lot,
and so is mine. And we see this over and over again. And we don't just see like 18 to 30-year-olds who are have a lot of angst. We have people in their 50s who are saying, I think I might have missed it. No, probably not, actually. It's evolving.
Mhm.
So there's that sense. But the other side that I like about this is that it includes all areas of our lives. You know, it includes like that the family, work, neighbor, church, or spiritual community. That's a way to kind of summarize the whole of the relational networks that we move in. And so God has a plan. We can follow him in each of those areas. Sometimes some of those areas may be more, they may rise up, and our secondary call may need to focus on family or neighbor or even church, you know, depending on who we are and where we are.
Mhm.
So I like the
Yeah.
dynamic elasticity to it. I think it's good and it fits real life.
So my personal example is I was in corporate America for about 12 years. Then I was part of a school for about 10 years. And now I've been in formal vocational ministry for 7 or 8 years. And at one point, one of my children was in the hospital and out of school for about 3 years due to an illness. So I stopped doing paid work, and that her healing and her journey became my work. And so all these things, when you talk about family, paid work, neighbor, church, they ebb and flow in importance, but they're all part of our work, and they're all part of our secondary call. Because I call work anything that's not leisure and not rest. Work is not leisure, not rest. Now there's a part of it that's
Parenting
paid.
definitely qualifies
Parenting
as
is
work.
Parenting is work. Unloading my dishwasher is work. All right, so let's just talk about a few myths of calling. First of all, this is especially strong in the age 20 to 35 sects of Western culture. Pursue your passion. If you're not pursuing your passion, you're not in line with what God wants you to do. And I'm going to say it rather strongly, I do not believe passion should be a primary job search criteria. It should be paid attention to, but not primary. And here's why. This is my passion caution. Finding your passion assumes that passion is fixed, and that if you find it, it's a destination and it's a finish line and it's an inherent quality. Whereas actually social science research shows that passion changes and develops over time due to experiences. So if you are trying to peg yourself into a passion, you're robbing yourself of the opportunity of experience helping you develop passions and for your passions to evolve. And Yale and Singapore University put a study together about passion. I have a link to it. There's an article, if you Google Missy Wallace passion job, and there's an article on the Gospel Coalition where I have a link to that study if you want to read more about it. But passions, when channeled into work, often don't translate to giftings. So Chip may love food. He may love to prepare food. Just yes.
You're confessing for me.
He may love to prepare food.
Sign up for that.
But he may not have the gifts to run a restaurant. To run a restaurant requires a lot of detail. To run a restaurant requires the ability to manage people, to keep them on schedule, a great service orientation. So loving food could be a passion that doesn't translate to the giftings to run a restaurant.
That's right.
So, there's a typo. Sorry about that. Social science also reveals that turning a passion into paid work can cause it to lose its pleasure. So you can see that with tennis players, for instance. That's just an obvious example. And professional athletes, sometimes like their whole dream of their whole childhood, football is my passion, tennis is my passion. Suddenly when you're monetizing it 5 years in, it loses its joy. And so that particularly becomes relevant when if cooking is where you get your joy for your leisure time, and now you've turned it into a restaurant, maybe your giftings aren't right, and now you've also lost your leisure joy. And so just a caution on thinking about passions as jobs. And finally, there's an old kind of, what do you call them, wise tales. You'll never work, what is it? If you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And I'm saying that is a biblical lie because I've done what I love a lot, and I still have a lot of bad days, and it is still work. And so scripture reveals that all work includes toil, regardless of its alignment with our interests and giftings. And so we have this point of view that if I'm struggling in my work, I must not be in the right paid vocation.
Right.
Where perhaps you really just need a change of perspective.
Yep.
So,
Huge.
okay, back to myths.
Yep.
Talk about the second one, Chip.
This idea that finding your calling will be easy, finding or pursuing your calling. And it gets to that idea that calling is really not a destination. Like we think of biblical examples, like how easy was it for Joseph to figure out that his calling was to be the prime minister of Egypt. Like it was a mess, right? It was a mess the whole time until the end. Moses really never got over it, I don't think. I mean, I think he always sort of was a tortured soul, but he ended up essentially fulfilling his calling. Maybe not quite as, he didn't get him into the promised land, but he got him to the edge. But it was an agonizing thing.
Yeah.
So,
and even Jesus at the very end, what does he say? Can this cup pass from me?
Yeah, exactly. That's
right? He's not saying my call is awesome. He was saying this is hard. Can this pass from me? Do I have to do this?
So it's a huge myth.
Yeah, and it's a very
people
very
think
Western myth.
If it's not easy, then it must be wrong.
Yeah.
And that's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
This one we've talked about before, worth is determined by performance, but we really know that as Christians, our worth is determined by the righteousness in Christ, and our performance is about being in line with what Christ would have us doing as part of his unfolding story. Calling, often we go off and try to discern it individually, but you actually work in communities around this. So speak to community.
We think about how, especially in the West, everything's individualistic, as we've said, but in Scripture, whenever somebody was called, it was always either the source of that calling came through the community of faith, or it was at least affirmed from the community of faith. So David is told he's going to be king by Samuel. That's community. He's anointed in front of his brothers. Takes a long, not easy road for him to get there. But then the nation says, we affirm this and we want you to be our king. And there's a sense of community in it. One of the things that we do with our clients who are working through calling discernment is we have a tool for them to get input from everybody that's worked with them, so that they can say, back to what you were saying before, that passion doesn't equal gifting. People see gifting, they see talent, and apparently you don't see the gifting to run a restaurant in me. So
I don't know.
It's putting me back on the pendulum between shame and superiority. But anyway, thank you, Missy. But no, I think that we need discerning people around us to be able to say, you're really gifted at that, or you're not. You're not. So, and that's the way it's in Scripture. That's practically what we need.
And then we've talked about both these other two in earlier slides, which is that calling ensures happiness and joy. Not only is work have toil, but when Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me, the following me usually has difficulty in it. And so likewise, if you're taking up your vocation to follow him, you will have difficulty in it. There will be places where it's difficulty. So calling requires difficulty, and finding your calling is not a finish line. It's dynamic. It's as dynamic as the Spirit's work in our lives. And so I would not be qualified for the position I was in and that I'm currently in if I had not had a huge chunk of my career in kind of hardcore corporate world, as well as some nonprofit management. And never in my life did I say, oh, I want to be a faith and work, professional when I'm 52. That was not on my list of things that I was looking to become. And so it's dynamic, it's organic, it evolves, and it's trusting the Spirit's work in our life to take the next right step.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about discernment. You said passion is not a good guide, primary to discernment. We look at calling discernment in some ways as the overlap of 4 circles. And the most important two, I guess, would probably be gifting and opportunity. So gifting is just a way of summarizing the capacities and capabilities that God has given you through your birth and your upbringing and your training. It's very rare for us, I think, to be called for long periods of time to do something that we don't have a strong ability to do. It can happen, but so gifting, and that's something that you and I can learn about. again, by getting feedback from our community, and there's other tools that we use for that. But the opposite side of that is opportunity, and that's where your gifting is needed in the real world. Sometimes we say your vocational calling happens at the intersection of the real you and the real world. And that's where the opportunity piece comes in. It always has to be validated eventually, not always initially, but validated by somebody saying, yes, we want this, we value this. Most of us need to be paid for our work. So we value this enough. And then there's two other pieces that come into play. Interest comes into play, which is a term we sometimes use in place of passion, because sometimes we define passion actually as sustained interest over time. It's something that continues to draw out your attention and your energy over time. It's not just a momentary kind of thing. And that's important because, and we do this is part of our work. A person who actually has the gifts to be an engineer, a doctor, and a film editor look the same on paper, believe it or not. And so what are they interested in? But the last one there is important too, Missy, and that's limitations. Because we are not limitless. And you know, when your daughter was sick, you could have technically had the other three, you might have opportunity, interest, and gifting to do all kinds of things, to travel around the world and be a consultant like you were, you know, before that stage of life, but you had a limitation that you embraced. Because you felt like your calling was different at that time, like you discerned that it was. And there's all kinds of limitations that we have. You guys may not be able to tell, but I'm 5'4", so I will not be playing in the NBA. So it's just never going to happen. It's a limit. So there's all kinds of limitations of circumstance, of birth. We get to certain stages in our lives. Even, you know, your resume, you're just never going to get from what you might have been capable of. So we have to look at the overlap of all these things.
What's interesting is that I believe that people that have been parenting the millennials, which is me, I've been parenting young. Well, I guess my kids are at the very beginning of the next group. We in the late 90s in parenting, we were getting the parenting advice that self-esteem was the most important. So I spent my daughter's first years telling her she could be anything she wanted to be, right? If you just try enough, right? We hear this, if you just try hard enough, you can be anything you want to be. This is actually theologically flawed. Like, if he's not going to be able to be in the NBA star, I also can't be in Broadway musicals. I don't have pitch. I will not be able to do that. No trying hard enough will solve that. And so it's actually freeing to help people understand it's not if you just try hard enough, you can be anything you want to be. Pay attention to how you've been wired. And how you've been wired also has to do with both limitations on your gifts, as well as limitations on other things you might have to do in your life. So if you have to pay your student loans, you have to pay attention to that. If your mother has cancer and you need to take her to chemotherapy, you might need to pay attention to that. So limitations is a rather broad character that really group that helps you think about it. Gifting and opportunity, those are the same color, because in Oz Guinness's book, he talks about those as a really important overlap between gifting and opportunity. And he uses opportunity to really include opportunity. His definition really would include limitations, interests, and opportunity. All right, so I'm gonna let you, this is one of VOCA Center's models.
Yeah, this is what we call the building blocks of calling, or a vocational calling. And we've still got that sort of that gifting and opportunity bit in the middle, which are the real you and the real world. I mentioned that earlier. And when we look at the real you side of the ledger, we start with your abilities, and that's what we mean, the talents or capabilities that you have. And again, we think we can measure that. We can measure that objectively. Skills are the capacities you develop, and usually your most energizing and effective skills are connected to your abilities. So you talked about Broadway, being able to sing. So that's a musical ability, or musical skill, talent. But if you are musical skill, like a musical deliverable, like you're able to actually perform. The person who's going to be good at that is typically going to have the raw ability, and then they're going to work hard and develop that ability. The working hard and development, that's the skill, and then you have the raw capacity. So they're different abilities and skills. When you align them, get more. We talked about passion. That's like your sustained interest over time. We talked about boundaries. So there's things that are all on the left. And then when you get out into the real world, which is the opportunity piece of Oz's paradigm, we're looking for, where do we fit? Where's there opportunity, meaning a need for the talents and skills we have? And then one of the things that we do a lot with our clients is we have them, as they identify areas of interest, before they go out and look for job interviews, they go out and they do something called an information interview. And it's kind of a best practice for a lot of different areas of exploration, but they find people who are in fields that are of interest to them, and they interview them. And they're interviewing first to figure out, based on what you do every day, is what you do a good fit for me? Second thing they're asking about is, what are the opportunities looking like in that field? Because all things considered, you don't want to jump onto a shrinking iceberg. You know, like actually it's not a good time to try and break into Broadway because Broadway's closed, right? So it's just a terrible time, and it's strange, but that's the reality of it. There's no opportunity there right now. But if you say yes, it's a fit, and yes, it's an opportunity, the last question you ask as you're exploring the real world is, what are the steps a person like me needs to take to get there? You know, one of the transitions I went through, I was a pastor for 20 years, and I moved to New York 7 years ago, and I had a whole range of things I was interested in doing, from being a pastor again to being a management consultant. And there's a lot of distance between a pastor and a management consultant. And so I just couldn't, there was too many steps for me in my stage of life. I had limitations. So I went into Christian nonprofit work, and that's actually slowly giving birth, and we're starting to do some management consulting. And so it just took a lot longer than I thought, but I couldn't do it directly. I had to do it incrementally. So that's the real world piece of this. Do you want to say anything about that? Because I want to get to the two gospel pieces.
Listening to you, my daughter that I've mentioned, who's 23 years old, her internships all through college were in the nonprofit space, and then she wanted to interview in the for-profit space. And every informational interview she went to said, you know what, you don't have any experience and analytical skills in the for-profit space. Your nonprofit work doesn't translate. So she was like, oh, I could never be in the for-profit space. I'm only 22 years old. And we said, well, what are next steps you could take? Right. And she found an internship program for people out of college, where they put you in an internship for 1 year to learn a new set of skills. So she's in a for-profit internship for 1 year. So same thing. She's now preparing herself.
Good. That's good. That's that idea of steps. It goes back to the idea that calling is not a destination, it's a journey. So there we have the sort of center of this diagram, real you, real world. But it's sandwiched in between two really important pieces, and that's your gospel identity and your gospel destiny. So our gospel identity is that idea that we have our identity in Christ, not in our work, whether our work is an embarrassment to us or it has the power to draw us in and actually take us over. It doesn't matter. That's not where you get your sense of self. You know, 1 John 3 talks about how our identity is God's children, and we've been called to Him, as we said, through the quotes from Oz. And then our gospel destiny is really interesting. I like Ephesians 2, where it says, you know, we're new creations in Christ. There again is identity, and we're created in Christ to do good works that God has planned in advance for us to do. And I feel like sometimes we need to point out to everybody that part of the good works that God has planned for us to do is our work. You know, it's not just helping old ladies across the street and volunteering at church, that it's our work. I mean, it's part of building God's world with Him. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And that's the gospel promise, that God has good work for you to do. Not work defined as all those myths about calling, but really has a promise that this is part of the plan for your life. That there's good work for you to do.
There's good work for you to do.
And that's hope. More fire hose here, Missy. This chart, this 2x2, is really a way to sort of summarize our experience of work and how we find, I would say, a gospel-founded meaning in our work. And we've got two frames of reference that actually answer the second question. I'll go to that. I'm there, so I'm going to start there. How do we approach our work? We have a secular approach to work, which kind of goes back to something that you already showed us, but it's for me and it's by me. That's on that left side, that individualistic side of calling. So the way I'm approaching my work, it's for me and it's by me. And I don't know. I mean, I think if you just look at your work as a way you've just got to do it to survive and you hate it and that's a for me and by me. And if you look at your work as a way you're going to put a stake in the ground and prove to the world that you matter, that's still for me and by me. It's still secular. And then there's a sacred way of looking at our work, a different frame, a different narrative. And then in that case, we do our work for God. We do our work for others, but we also do our work with God. And I'll just throw that out there. And some of you want to hear about it in the Q&A, you can ask about it. But Psalm 127 talks about, he says, unless the Lord builds a house, the builders build in vain. Unless the Lord protects the city, the guards stand watch in vain. And there's this idea that God's a builder and God's a protector. I think those are two functions that God is, that's part of what he's doing in the world right now. Moving towards all things being united under Christ. He's building, he's protecting. And then there's a third idea of something that God's doing in the world, and that's from Psalm 104, where it just talks about how God provides through the work of people. And so God is not just telling us to work for him, which is kind of a Colossians 3, do your work for the Lord, but he's also inviting us to work with him actively through our work. And that all benefits others. So there's the secular and there's the sacred. So that's how we approach our work. That's the way we think it. There's also the way we experience it. And this is a analogy. I like to talk about the chore and the treehouse. When I was a boy, I was raised correctly. I had to do chores, and I had to do chores were the work you had to do to get to do what you wanted to do. So like I had to clear the table and take out the trash and do my homework before I could go play. That's just the way I thought it worked. You get it done, then you could do what you want. And then there's something else that I did when I was a kid and I had time in my hands, and I built tree houses. And they weren't pretty. They were more just like platforms in a tree. But it looked when I think about it now, it looked an awful lot like work. Mm-hmm. And we're gathering materials, we're exerting effort. There was sweat and there's blood because the hammer and all that saws and all these kinds of things. And it looked like work, but it didn't feel like work. Mm-hmm. And so I like to think of work as every task that you have to do, whether it's paid work or not, it's somewhere on that continuum between feeling like a chore and feeling like a treehouse project. It's something where you experience what we call flow. And then that nets out this 2x2 of different experiences of work. So when we approach our work from a secular frame, and whether Christians are very susceptible to this, and our work is a chore, work just becomes a grind. It just sucks the life out of us, and we just want to get through it. It's meaningless time. It's time burned, and we just grind through it. When we're approaching our work from a secular point of view, and it's treehouse work, it's work that we really love, work becomes our God. It's something that gives us fulfillment and power, and we put it above everything else. It's very seductive. And one of the big things that we want to try and help people do is move above this line and have a sacred approach to the work, that it's for God and with God and for others. And then even when we have chore work to do or elements of our jobs that feel like a chore, it's still growth. Like there's still spiritual upside in it, even though it feels like, it's not something we get enjoyment out of or fulfillment. And for those moments, and it may just be moments, it may just be a task, it may just be, momentary, when we experience flow, when it feels good, that's a gift. And some of us get the gift more and more times than others, which is one of those, conundrums of life. Why does God give some of us this and some of us that? And even when you find a job that you love, chances are that, the treehouse piece isn't going to stay forever. It's going to continue to evolve. So that's a lot there. What do you think? What do you want?
Oh, I love how you talk about a gift, because I think that people that get a lot of choice in what type of work they want to do, they may experience the gift more often, which means it comes with incredible privilege. And so people who literally are trying to put food on the table, maybe they have something that prevents them from getting the kind of work they want. Maybe it's a schedule constraint. Maybe they actually have a conviction on their record or a felony on their record or something. And so that perhaps, and they've, served their punishment and now they are fully redeemed and ready to go, but they can't get rid of that blur. And so now they can't get access to the type of work they want. And so some people are stuck a bit more in chore work than others. So I do think it's really important that we help people who do get treehouse work sometimes to realize the unbelievable privilege of that, and not to be frustrated when there's chore work in it.
Yeah, and I think almost everybody's job has some elements of chore work. You said that before, so good.
Sure. So it's interesting. One thing I'd love to say about this is I spent a huge part of my career thinking that this was the hierarchy of work in God's kingdom, that the people that worked for the church, the ministers, were on the A team. And then if you couldn't be on the A team, that the A- team were the missionaries or the Christian nonprofits. And then right below that would be doctors, nurses, teachers.
Social sector, yeah.
Everybody else was on the D team, and that there was even a team below this team, which was the like people in banking or consulting or corporate law. And I spent a chunk of my career like on the team below the team here.
At the bottom.
At the bottom. And so understanding that all good work is part of God's unfolding story, and that this pyramid is not a hierarchy of work in God's eyes. It's really important.
I think I was influenced by that same paradigm as well, and felt guilty about it. Still do sometimes, actually. The other thing I think that's important here to point out is that there's a destructive side to life in full-time vocational ministry. And I'm not saying it happens to everybody. I'm not saying everybody that's a leader is destructive, but I mean, we get a new headline every week.
Broken systems, broken people.
And so it's kind of this, it's just a huge sweeping of the dark side under the rug to think that, well, if I just do church work, and I was a pastor for 20 years, and sometimes I would get this feeling as I was interviewing potential people for our staff that they thought if they would work there, it would kind of help them be better Christians. And I was like, nope. I'm sorry. There's parts of this that can be challenging, destructive, or toxic. And so there's a humility that actually comes to this for those of us in vocational work to realize that just by dint of what we're doing, we don't have a leg up on everybody else.
Yeah. So we could have a whole nother course on finding the redemptive edge in your work, but understanding that God's creational goodness is in each industry, as well as the brokenness, and how do we as Christians push against the brokenness in our various spheres. So we have two slides here, ways pastors or people in ministry can encourage those looking for their calling. I know we have some coaches on here, executive coaches. And we have a slide about how marketplace leaders can encourage others by. There's a good bit of overlap. I'm going to blow through these pretty quickly to give you guys some time for some Q&A. But pastors can encourage, actually you do the pastors because you've been a pastor.
Yeah, I think one of the best things you can do as a pastor has to do with your language. Understanding many people in the marketplace they don't receive a call the way people in ministry do. They don't talk about it, but you can reframe that as a spiritual shepherd, and you can point out how their work matters and is part of God's kingdom. And I'm pointing to my screen here, you guys can't tell. Giving congregants a vision for the importance of all industry is part of God's unfolding narrative. You can reframe that. The secondary calling idea, the theology that we put in here. You talk about workplace visits here, I think. That's a huge thing that I used to do. And I guess you still can do a Zoom coffee if depending on the restrictions in where you are geographically with COVID and so, but by going and visiting them, and not going and visiting them to talk about the church or recruit them for anything, but to understand what they do, to go on a listening tour and visit people at work, it's huge because it's not just saying from the pulpit that what their work matters, and it's we all are the same tier level with secondary callings, no matter where it is. You're actually communicating that it's true. So I think that's another one.
There's a really easy way to do that because it's hard to get going on a listening tour on your calendar if you're a pastor. And the way to do it is every time someone calls and says, "Hey, pastor, can I talk to you?" Instead of saying, "Yeah, come by the church tomorrow at 11, say, "Sure, I'd be happy to meet you at your office." Now, sometimes they'll say no because they have something personal and they don't want to get emotional in their office. A lot of times they'll say yes. And if you do that twice a week for a year, you've hit over 100 workplaces.
Yeah, and then a lot of churches do things about spiritual gifts and so forth, and it almost always is 100% applied to serving in the church, and it's kind of like, we don't really believe the kingdom is limited to the church. I don't think, most of us don't. So look at it as more like we're equipping our people to be kingdom players wherever they are. And what a gift to send somebody back to their workplace with confidence in their God-given skills and abilities. And then one of the last things we said on here is just to remember that life in the marketplace is hard. And I remember at times when I was pastoring a suburban church, so I had a mix of different kinds of people in my church, but the professionals who got to travel, who got all the perks of like points and all that kind of thing, who had the means to do some of the things that I wish I sort of envied them. And I thought they had a really easy life. And now spending years walking alongside the life of marketplace leaders, most of them are plagued by an almost constant sense of insecurity and that the whole thing could just wither up and blow away at any instant. And they also work a lot. Like they just burn a lot of hours. They work really hard. Doesn't matter whether they're a farmer or a mechanic or a banker. There's a tremendous fear and there's and demand of working really hard. And so we've done some work where we've gotten pastors and marketplace people in the same room and said, what do you want the other to know? That's the number one thing they both say. I want you to understand that my job is hard.
Interesting. And so marketplace leaders can encourage others when people come to you in the marketplace, et cetera. Lots of these things are on here are the same, but the importance of having a caller before you have a call, assessing your own beliefs. Do you believe industry callings are as worthy as Christian ones? Examine your own idolatries in your work. Give colleagues a vision for the importance of all industries as part of God's unfolding narrative. Reinforce the secondary call as evolving and sometimes uncertain, continually reinforcing the understanding of primary call. Give people the confidence that they do not have to have it all figured out, and what they're doing now doesn't necessarily have to be forever. Every time you talk to someone, if they say, I'm not sure I'm working in my passion, talk to them about passions as evolving, talking to them about passions. Ask some questions about that. Well, what do you think your passion is? Well, do you think that will be your passion forever? Well, do you think you have the gifts to work in that passion? Do you think working in that passion might actually reduce its interest to you? And discuss the ways that God has evolved your call and how you've discerned his voice over time, and how many surprises there have been, how many twists and turns there have been on your journey of finding your call. And then, of course, try to get them to find some objective views of what their gifts are, take some testing, etc., as well as understanding what their idolatries are. And so let's turn it over to you, and if you want Q&A. I think we have a small enough group where you can just turn your mute off and ask some questions. But Lauren, if you've seen some questions in the chat that you want to share with us, please let us know.
Someone asked for recommendations for college student, those entering into college, if you have books or study recommendations.
You know, the career services offices are actually extremely good. They won't necessarily ground it for them in the identity of Christ, but I have not seen a college yet that doesn't have a career services that'll help you look at your gifts and abilities and understand that part of your world. And then I know that, I think someone put it in the chat, Made to Flourish has a book out around Worked Up, which is particularly good around these topics.
I also recommend an assessment. It's called the Highlands Ability Battery. We use it in our leadership development and our vocational discernment coaching, but it's been recommended by the Wall Street Journal. What's unique about it is it doesn't ask the student or any of us, it doesn't ask you what you think about yourself. It tests you doing tasks and measures how quickly and efficiently and accurately you do them. So it gives you really an objective snapshot of your talent, and then it links those abilities to actual jobs. It's work. I mean, it's work to do it, and it's work to sort through it. It provides a lot of data. Sometimes it's not a simple, easy answer, but it's an objective answer, and the science goes back 100 years. So the Highlands Ability Battery is a tool that we would recommend.
And the science that built that tool There's also been a shortened version of it that's online called U Science, YOU, like the science of U Science. I think it's uscience.com. And as a starter point, you can take your U Science ability test for, I think it's like $25 or $30. So people that are cost constrained and can't take the Highlands ability, which is more comprehensive and better, U Science is a great start. And by the way, I've taken them both again recently in my 50s. So you don't have to be a college graduate for those tools to be helpful. Not, yes, I actually did take the Highlands recently. I'll talk to you about that.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. Didn't take it with me. Yeah, that's great. Other questions? Berkman, yeah.
Very great presentation you guys did today. Very helpful.
Thank you. Are there any people from other contexts where these models don't feel helpful? And you say this does not work. I know last time we gave this presentation, we had some people that worked with a lot of people in poverty, and he was like, this is not helpful. They do not have time to do this. They are barely making ends meet, working in their minimum wage job. No? Okay.
I would just, of course, my mind is going to the connection between opportunity and the national conversation around diversity, inclusion, and equity. You know, I think a lot about, we're here in the Deep South. And so, and I think about our city and what the opportunities are for vocation and work and ministry. It's still very gender segregated. It's still very, there's a lot of thinking, I think, that needs to take place about lifting up opportunities. And I just love for you to speak to that. So how do we, as market leaders, increase opportunities so that more believers can experience gift? Because I do think it is a privilege, but there's a scraping and a striving, I think, that's present, especially here, where maybe that's not flourishing as much as it ought to be. Just love your thoughts on that.
Oh, I just love that you've asked that. And both the organization that I'm paid to work for right now, as well as an organization that I'm the volunteer of on a board, are going through processes with consultants to actually examine that in the corporate culture, to make sure the corporate culture is examining that, which leads to policy change. And so I think there's so many policy biases into our organizations, not to mention personal biases that may exist in our organizations. And so I think it is, to the extent you have influence and voice, it's very important to examine these things. We're actually piloting an app right now called Thrive. And this app is around helping people in the DEI space. And one of the chapters of the app is around policies. And interesting, one of the very most important things that you can do for underrepresented groups in organizations is to provide them very clear mentorship, to be preparing them and tracking them for promotions and what they should look for and see and how to supplement things, et cetera, et cetera. There was a very interesting Forbes article about that.
Yeah, excuse me. I would just add, I think that 85% of jobs come through a personal connection. So anytime that you, first of all, you have to expand your own network, your web of relationships, it has to be diverse, and then as you see opportunities come at your place of employment, that you can recommend people, or you're talking like once they're hired, they need a sponsor. That's true too. Somebody to pull them, help them understand how to navigate a culture. But I think just by dint of your connections and pulling them in and putting them forward for opportunities that they're qualified for, that's a very granular way that we can do that. But we don't always think about in those terms.
And I think what he said, the 85% stat, we're trying to make policy changes in our organization, as well as the one that I'm on the board of, to reduce that.
Mm.
So how are we making sure every single job opening is posted publicly, not, oh, friend of a friend before it's even posted? How are we making sure that we are actually posting the jobs in place when perhaps multi-ethnic or multicultural candidates would find the job posting? So we're trying to take more aggressive measures to make sure we are taking the time. One of the major complaints that people first give is, oh, it's a pipeline issue. I couldn't find anyone. That, and data has supported, it's not a pipeline issue, it's an effort issue. How hard are you willing to find? How hard are you willing to create policies and to get out of your personal networks? Okay, well, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you very much for being with us today. And if anything we've said prickled you in a particular way or feels untrue to you, we always love feedback on our models, et cetera. So feel free to email us, and we thank you for your time. Thank you,
Yeah.
Chip, for partnering with us today.
Thank you, Missy.
Yes.
Great to be here.
Yes. And if you know people looking for particular vocational help in a class environment or one-on-one environment, Chip's organization does a phenomenal job.
Yeah, it's vocacenter.org. Okay, see you later.